Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the estrous cycle, which is a topic that we cover in heavy depth when we study veterinary science, which is a part of our agricultural career pathway, beginning with intro to ag, then going on to animal science, and then veterinary science to finish. So the estrous cycle is a topic that we cover in veterinary science because as a veterinarian, it is very important to understand the best times to fertilize a female in order to maximize production for farmers and those who are breeding animals, because it is the veterinarian that actually has to prescribe the synthetic hormones that will induce ovulation in the animal. So we cover this topic pretty in depth in veterinary science, and so I'm going to begin with a little bit of endocrinology. And if you don't know what endocrinology, it's, well, if you look at the suffix there, ology on the end, that means the study of. So endocrinology is the study of the endocrine glands, which are what produce our hormones. Okay. So the first hormone that I talk about is GnRH, which is at the very top there. That's gonadotropin releasing hormone is what it stands for. And GnRH is kind of the mother of all hormones in the female estrous cycle. Okay, so like nothing else can happen without having GnRH to first stimulate a reaction. Okay, so looking at that diagram that I have over on the right side, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, a lot of words I know, but you can see that the hypothalamus is at the very top there, and the hypothalamus is a gland that's found in the brain of both male and female. But in this case, we're looking at the female. So the hypothalamus is what releases our gonadotropin releasing hormone, so our GnRH. Okay, so our GnRH is then transported, once it's released from the hypothalamus, it travels on down to the anterior pituitary, which is another gland in your brain, and it tells the anterior pituitary, hey, we need to have a baby, so I need you to release a couple things in order to initiate this process. So GnRH comes from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary through this hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. That's that big bolded word there in that middle paragraph. And that's just the pathway that it takes to that anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so what it does, GnRH, it tells the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. And FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. LH stands for luteinizing hormone. And on this next slide here, I'll kind of get to what those two are. So your FSH, as the name implies, it stimulates the follicle. And the follicle is a little kind of bulb looking thing on an ovary. So if you are looking at your female reproductive tract, typically on average there's your two ovaries that have fallopian tubes leading down into the uterus, and those ovaries are what releases your egg, okay, or eggs. So if you want to think of, for the purpose of this lecture, think of your ovary as a little planet, okay? So on your ovary you have these follicles, which you could look at as like craters or something. Maybe your ovary's a moon, okay, and you have little craters on there. So the follicles are what will eventually rupture and release an egg. So FSH is very important in stimulating the growth of that follicle so that it will eventually rupture and release an egg so that it can be fertilized and the female can become pregnant. Okay, so that FSH, it travels to the ovaries through systemic blood circulation. And there's two different types of circulation. There's systemic and pulmonary. Pulmonary circulation is just blood exchange between the heart and lungs, whereas the systemic blood circulation just means that it carries throughout the entire body. So once the FSH travels down to your little planet, your little ovary, it tells that follicle to grow, okay? So once our follicle is told that it needs to grow, you kind of get to the next step. So your LH, or luteinizing hormone, which is also released from the anterior pituitary. If you go back to this chart, you can see that underneath anterior pituitary it says FSH and LH. So is also released from that point, also travels through the systemic blood circulation. And what's really important about LH, what's really important to note, is that this is what causes the actual ovulation to happen. So it gets kind of tricky because your follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, is what tells your follicle to initially grow, but then there's an LH spike in the female that causes that egg to finally rupture through. So if you're looking at the ovarian changes chart over there on the right, starting in the, we'll start in the bottom picture, that egg, that ovary on the very bottom. So you can see over on the left it says that it has a developing follicle, and this is the middle luteal phase. But you can see that that follicle is developing, which is caused by that FSH. Okay, you move up one picture into your late luteal or follicular stage, and you can see that follicle has grown in size. And then you move up one more picture and you have your mature follicle, and that mature follicle is what will rupture due to that spike in LH causing your ovum or your egg to be released. So you see from that mature follicle, that top left picture, if you follow the arrow to the next one, there you can see the ovum kind of popping out of that ruptured follicle. Okay, so that is how the egg is released. And then the next kind of structure that I'll talk about is the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum is where progesterone is produced, and progesterone is another very important hormone, which I will talk about here. So progesterone, which is also known as P4, like I said, is produced by the corpus luteum. So on your little planet that you have, or your moon, you could have craters and mounds. Okay, so let's say that your craters are follicles and your mounds are your corpus luteums. Okay, so it's important to note that they kind of work opposite one another. So when you have a very mature follicle, you're going to have a much reduced or regressed corpus luteum, or CL. And when you have a very mature CL, your follicle is going to be very small. Okay, so basically what progesterone does is it prevents cyclicity by acting on that anterior pituitary in a negative feedback fashion. So that negative feedback just means that it suppresses the release of FSH and LH in this case. So if you're looking at your little planet, progesterone, so your little corpus luteums are these mounds on your planet, and progesterone puts this big old dome over your planet, that basically is protective dome that is basically putting a cap on the female cycle so that pregnancy cannot occur. So what it does also is it will maintain pregnancy by suppressing these uterine contractions. So once a female becomes pregnant, progesterone also plays an important role in that sense. So number one, it caps the system, so it caps all other hormones. But number two, when a female becomes pregnant, it also helps to maintain pregnancy so that the uterine wall doesn't reject that embryo that has implanted itself. Okay, and then I have estrogen on here. So estrogen is produced and released by the follicle. So the follicle, which once again is what ruptures and releases that egg. So that same structure is what produces estrogen. So as the follicle grows and matures, estrogen will increase, kind of similar to the corpus luteum. As the corpus luteum grows and matures, progesterone will increase. So estrogen kind of has a positive feedback on that anterior pituitary as opposed to progesterone. So progesterone puts the dome on and it says, hey, I'm preventing this cycle. And estrogen is what kind of busts through that dome and says, nope, we're ready to have a baby. Okay, so it will also cause the uterus to contract and actually initiates the production of mucus from the cervix, which will allow for an easier pathway for sperm to travel up through the uterus and into the fallopian tube in order to fertilize an egg. So it plays a very important role as well. And you can kind of see on that graph over on the right, from the ovary, there's two branches off. One the corpus luteum, one the follicle, and it tells you the two hormones that it produces there in that image. Okay, and then the last hormone I'm going to talk about is prostaglandin, or PGF2A, the fancy name. This is produced by the uterine endometrium, and the endometrium is just a fancy word for the lining of the uterus. So that lining that you shed every month is the same site of prostaglandin production. Okay, so prostaglandin, it helps to initiate ovulation by killing the corpus luteum. So remember, the corpus luteum produces that progesterone, which caps the system. Okay, so it prevents any ovulation from occurring. But what happens is prostaglandin comes through. It's like a little cannon that shoots through and busts that dome open. So that your estrogen and LH and FSH can all spike, causing the ovulation to occur. So prostaglandin is important in that aspect, that it is what causes the death of the CL. So looking back on this ovarian changes graph, you can kind of see, starting in that bottom picture again, where the mature corpus luteum is. So you have very, very high progesterone levels there for that mature corpus luteum, very low estrogen levels because your follicle is just developing. But then as you move to your left up that diagram, the CL starts to regress, or your corpus luteum starts to regress. That means that less progesterone is being produced while more estrogen is being produced by that developing follicle. And then once you get to your mature follicle, you have that old corpus luteum, which is completely regressed. And that mature follicle didn't get to its mature state until that prostaglandin F2 alpha came in and shot through that progesterone dome to kill off that CL. So that is all I have for the endocrinology section of the estrous cycle.